Hi, so in this video, I'm going to show you how I recreate this registration form, and it has real-time validation. So as you can see, when I hover over an input, all the requirements for that input show up, and as I start typing, I get feedback on whether I'm fulfilling or not fulfilling the requirements. So if I start typing, I can now get feedback on it. And if I try and submit the form and one of the requirements isn't completely fulfilled, I get this tooltip which shows a list of all the things that are wrong with that particular input. So let's try something that works. So last week on my blog, I wrote about form validation and all the different techniques that you can use for it. So if you want to look at that article, you can check it out here. So I'm going to be using a lot of the techniques I discussed there, so you might want to check it out first. But so that's it. Let's get started. So this is the HTML behind the page. As you can see, we've got this form, and in the form we've got three inputs. So for the username, the password, and then the password repeat. So the way it works is that we just have the label, and then within the label we've got like the span, which is the actual label, and then the input itself, and then this unordered list of the input requirements. So at the moment, the JavaScript, our own custom JavaScript is completely empty, so it's just the HTML and CSS. And if I switch over, you can see how it works. So if I hover over or interact with any inputs, the input requirements show. So I'm doing that with just CSS. I'll show you how it works. So if I go down here, so I've just put a transition on the max height. So I'm just changing it from 0 to just any large number that will be able to fit the input requirements. So for some reason it doesn't work with height, it only works with max height. So that's how I'm doing that. So if I go back here and I start typing, you can see that as soon as I hit 3 characters, it shows that it's valid. And the reason it's doing that is because if we go back to the inputs, I put this minimum length here. So that means that the browser inbuilt is actually just checking to make sure that it fits that requirement. But it doesn't affect if I do special characters. So even though I wrote it here, there's no way for the browser to know that that's actually a requirement yet. So there's one way we can do it, putting in the HTML. We can use the pattern attributes. And the way that works is that we just put in a regular expression here, so to just tell the browser what kind of characters should match this particular input. But we're not going to do that. We're going to actually do it with JavaScript, and there are 2 reasons we're going to do that. So number 1 is that if we use that pattern attribute, then we're going to have to put all the requirements in that just one regular expression. And that means that if any of the requirements fail, the user is just going to get that one error message. So they're not going to know which particular one. So if you go down here to the input requirements for the password, we can use one regular expression, I think anyway, to do all of these requirements. But then if the user doesn't put a lowercase letter, for example, they're just going to get the same error message saying that it didn't match this particular pattern that we needed. So you could still use the pattern attribute as a fallback if you want, but we're just going to do it with JavaScript for now. Okay, so we're going to create a custom validation prototype, which will handle the validation for each input. So what it's going to do is 4 things. It's going to first keep track of what needs to be checked for each particular input to make sure it's valid. So if we go back here, for the username, we've got these 2 requirements, but for password, we've got these. So each input has its own validation checks that we need to do. So it's going to keep track of that first. And then second, if we find any problems with the inputs, we want to be able to keep track of all the error messages for that particular input. And then third, we want to create a function to be able to easily add error messages to that storage. And then finally, we want a function to be able to retrieve those error messages once we're done and then display it in that browser tooltip we saw at the beginning. So I'm just going to get started. Custom validation. So I'm just going to initialize it with this invalidities empty array. And this array is where we're going to keep all the error messages. So once we've had had this function. Now we can create the prototype. So first of all, we need that function to add the invalidity. Then we need a function to retrieve the invalidities. And then finally, a function to check the validity of that particular input. Okay, so I'm just going to go here. So this function, we need to pass the message to it. And then what we're going to do is push to the array, push message, simple. And then to get the invalidities, this dot invalidities dot join. So seeing as it's an array, but what we need it to be is one simple string. So I'm going to add a full stop to each of them and then add a line break. And then we're going to return it. And then check validity, I'll come back to. So I'm going to start with this username input. So a lot of things I'm going to do at first is going to be very inefficient, but then afterwards I'm going to refine it and make it more easily extendable to the other inputs. But first of all, I'm just going to work with this username input. So if we look at this check validity function, what we want to do is make sure that these two requirements are satisfied. So we can do that by simply checking the input value and matching it against either a regular expression, or for the first one, just checking if it's 3 characters long. So if we go back here, so what we're going to do is pass it the input. So if we say if input.value.length is less than 3, then what we need to do is 2 things. So first of all, add this dot add invalidity. So we're going to say this input needs to be at least 3 characters long. So that's one thing. But next what we want to do is add a class to each of these elements. So if it's incorrect, we want to add a class of invalid to it. And if it is correct, or if it is valid rather, add a class of valid to it. So here we're doing the invalid state. So first of all, we want to get the element that we need to add that add the classes to. So now we're selecting that particular element, and then what we're going to say is element.class_list.add invalid. And then just in case it was valid before, let's remove the valid one. Okay, so let's go else. Let's copy this. So let's just switch that around and add, right? Okay, that's cool. So then we've done the first one. And then let's check for the second one. So check to make sure that it only contains letters and numbers. And so to do this, we're going to do a regular expression. So what we want to do is check to see if it matches anything that does not, that is not a letter or a number. So match G. So I think A to Z, 0 to 9. So this dot add invalidity, let's say only letters and numbers are allowed. And then let's copy that and change it to this. Oh, how did I miss that? And then else. Okay, so let's go down here. So what we need to do now is check. So every time someone is typing in that input, we need to do this, perform these checks. So first of all, what we're going to do is get username input. So username input. So I'm going to add a sub property, which is custom validation, and set it equals to a new instance of this custom validation prototype. And then we're going to add an event listener. So username input dot add event listener key up function. Okay, so we've added the event listener function. So what we want to do next is do a check validity on it. So dot custom validation dot check validity, and then just pass this particular input. Okay, so let's see if it works. So if I'm typing, that's fine, 3 characters, and then if I do that, it goes off. So great, so it works. Okay, so that works. But like I said before, there are many things here that really need to be separated so that it can easily be extended to other inputs, because right now this doesn't really work it only works for this particular input, and it's not really the best way. For example, this check validity function, there are a lot of things that are being repeated here, so adding the class, removing the class, and all of those things. And really we should just be able to, this whole prototype should really be agnostic of any particular input. So we're going to change some things. So first of all, here we can see that we're doing the same sort of thing. So we're doing 3 things here. We're first checking if the input is valid, and then adding an error message or changing classes on that particular element. So we can change this. So what I'm going to do here is create an array, username validity checks. So I'm creating an array of all the checks that we need to perform on the username element. So first we're going to have a function to say is invalid. So function input. So first one, we're checking if the input.value.length is less than 3. So what we want to do is return, it's invalid if the input.value.length is less than 3. So this function is invalid would be true if this is true as well. So the next thing we need is the error message if it is. So invalidity message. So here I've just said this input needs to be 3 characters long. So let's cut that and put that here. And then finally, we need the element that we're going to change the class on. So here, put that here. So now I'm just going to do the same for the next one. So now what we can do is actually remove this. Whoops. And then just loop through this array. So let's go for I equals to 0. I is less than username validity checks dot length. I plus plus. So first of all, let's see if it's invalid. So is invalid is equals to username validity checks I dot is invalid, checking against the input. And then if it is invalid, what we want to do is add invalidity message name validity checks I dot invalidity message. So pass that message, and then what we want to do is do the classes. So if it is invalid, then dot element dot add class list rather dot add invalid, and then remove valid. So else remove and add. Okay, so we've cleaned that up a little bit. Let's just double check to see if it all still works. So refresh the page, start typing. Okay, so there's something wrong. So here, oh, there's a problem with that. Is that the problem? Okay, cool. So now it's working again. Cool. So here we've now abstracted this out here. but we're still calling username validity checks within this custom validation function. And like I said, this custom validation prototype needs to be completely agnostic of which particular input it is. So what I'm going to do is actually here, this, whoops, dot validity checks. Set it to an empty array. So when we're initializing this down here, new custom validation, what we want to do is set which array should be this validity checks here. So if I copy this, dot validity checks equals to, and then set it to that array. So that means here where we're calling username validity checks, what we should actually be doing is calling this dot validity checks. So let's change that. Okay, so we've done that now. Let's just double check everything's still working. Great. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is change this event listener. And what we want to do instead is just add an event listener to all of the inputs. So what we can do is inputs equals to document.query selector all instead. So all inputs, but not the ones that are type submit. Type equals to submit. Okay. So for I equals to 0, inputs I. So let's copy this. Dot add event listener key up. And so instead of username input, we want to do this. So let's remove that. Inputs I dot add event listener key up. And then this, the custom validation. Okay, cool. And then what we want to do is do all the custom validation for the other ones. So here we've got the username input. So let's repeat this for the other two. So for password input. Okay, so what I've done here is the 3 inputs here, and then for each of them, we've got we're initializing this prototype, so custom validation, and then also adding validity checks. So we haven't actually added these arrays yet, so I'm going to do that right now. Okay, so I've added the 3 arrays, and I'm just going to talk you through how I've done it. So for the password validity checks, we need to first check if the value, the length of the value is less than 8 or greater than 8 and less than 100. And here we're checking that it contains at least a number. So we're trying to see if the input.value.matching of a number doesn't exist. Then we're doing the same for lowercase, then uppercase, and then we're checking one of these special characters must be present as well. And then for the password repeats, the only check we're doing is to make sure that the value has to be equals to the password value. Let's try. So first of all, that's done. Let's see. I'm adding a number or a special character, adding a number, adding an uppercase, and then that works. Okay, so we're almost done. We just need to make a few changes. So as you can see, for this password repeat validity check, there's no input requirement here. So I just want to make a slight modification to this function. So to first check if there is actually an element that we want to add or remove the classes to. So I'm just going to quickly do that. Requirement element equals to this. So if requirement element does exist, then we do if it's valid and if it's not. So first of all, let's change that, remove that. And then all we need to do is check for that here. So okay, so that's better. So we've got the validity checks here, and then we've got that. So all this kind of works, but what we want to do is, at the moment, if things don't work. So if I do that and I press submit, we're still just getting this one error message. We're not getting all the error messages. So we're never actually calling this get invalidities function and passing it to set custom validity on that input. But what we want to do is make sure that only happens when you press submit. So we have to do another event listener. Submit equals to submit dot add event listener, click function. So we're going to sort of repeat here. So what I'm going to do is change this check validity and create its own function. So up here, our function check, and it's going to be passed an input. So let's move this up here first, and then just go check validity, this. So on submit, what we want to do is loop through all the inputs and then perform this check validity on them. So okay, so this isn't going to totally work yet, but let's just try and see what happens. So wait, am I putting this there? Aha, this should be input. Refresh here, blah blah blah. Okay, if I click submit, we still haven't called that get invalidities function yet. So first of all, we need to reset the invalidities dot custom validation dot invalidities, and then perform the check validity again, and then if we find actual invalidities, dot length is or equals to 0. And let's also make sure that it's not empty. And input dot value not equals to empty, right? So this is if we don't find any invalidity, custom validity, to just an empty array. So this is a native function that we can call to set what happens, to set this tooltip here. So else, so if there are, so get the message. So now we're going to actually call custom validation dot get invalidities and set it to the message, and then input dot set custom validity to that message. Our message equals to. Okay, so let's see. If I go back here, refresh, if I type, that's fine. If I do that, but that's not. So now we are getting all the error messages. So first, the input needs to be between 8 and 100. At least one number is required. At least one uppercase letter is required, and special characters. So let's see if I do more, or let's do something that will actually pass. But then here, it doesn't pass. So if I press submit, this password needs to match the first one. And if I go back here and I start adding special characters, submit, only letters and numbers are allowed. Okay, so that's pretty much it. So just to go over everything again, so we're starting with this custom validation prototype. So it has the invalidities array, which is all the error messages. Then the validity checks is the array of checks that we need to perform on that input. Then we've got these three functions. So one to add an error message to that array, one to retrieve all the messages in that array and convert it to a string. And then we have the final one, which is to loop through all the validity checks for that particular custom validation, and also change the class on that element to say whether it's valid or invalid. So here we've got the array of the validity checks for each of the inputs. And then here, check this input. So I think I'm going to change this to check input instead of check validity, because that probably makes a bit more sense. So if we go back here, check input, okay. So here we're setting up custom validation and setting up which array of validity checks should be for that particular input. And then finally, whenever people interact with each particular input, we're performing the validity checks, and then also on submit, performing the validity checks, and also setting the custom validity. So we're done. Thanks for watching.